It was deep into the night, and the silence of Boston seemed to foretell a cataclysmic storm. The date was April 18, 1775. The tension between the arrogance of a vast empire across the Atlantic and the dream of independence on these shores had reached its peak. The gunpowder was piled high, waiting only for a spark. Across the Charles River, the chill wind bit to the bone, but Paul Revere was sweating. He knew that if tonight failed, the dream of liberty would die in its infancy. British General Thomas Gage had secretly readied 700 redcoats, their destination Concord, where the rebels had hidden their arms and gunpowder. But the greater prize was Samuel Adams and John Hancock hiding in Lexington. The British believed that hanging these two leaders would extinguish the fire of rebellion forever, but they did not know that the Sons of Liberty were watching from every shadow and every brick wall in Boston. While the city slept, the Old North Church and the shadowy world along the riverbank were wide awake. Paul Revere was preparing to cross the river, but first he needed a signal. Were the British coming by land or by sea? The future of America depended on this answer. Revere had instructed the church sexton, Robert Newman, to signal with lanterns from the steeple, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. That was the historic code. Revere stood on the opposite shore, eyes fixed on the church spire. Time seemed to stand still. His heart beat faster than the waves of the Charles River. Suddenly, a speck of light pierced the darkness atop the spire. Revere's breath caught. One light, or would there be another? In an instant, a second light flared beside the first. 2 lanterns. The meaning was clear. The British were coming by water. They would row across the Charles to Cambridge and march toward Lexington. Revere wasted no time. He silently launched his small boat into the river. But the danger was far from over. Anchored at the mouth of the river was the British warship HMS Somerset. Its massive cannons were trained on the city. The slightest sound of Revere's oars reaching the ears of the British sentries would mean the end. He wrapped the oars in cloth to muffle the sound. The moon had not yet fully risen, and in the dim light, the warship stood like a massive aquatic monster. Revere navigated carefully, staying within the ship's shadow. He knew that if he reached the other side, the most important ride in history, the midnight ride, would begin. Waiting for him on the opposite shore was a spirited horse named Brown Beauty. The sound of her hooves would wake America tonight, and that awakening would change the map of the world. As he stepped onto the shore, Revere felt he was no longer a simple silversmith. He was now a messenger of history. He mounted the horse and pulled the reins. Destination, Lexington. But British patrols were waiting at every turn. Touching the soil of Charlestown, Revere's horse, Brown Beauty, took off like the wind. On the dusty road, under the dim moonlight, Paul Revere's shadow grew longer. But before he had gone far, he spotted 2 shadowy figures at a dark bend in the road. 2 British officers on horseback were waiting under the trees to intercept him. Their pistols glinted in the moonlight. Revere made a split-second decision. He knew he couldn't outrun them on the straight path. He yanked the reins and drove his horse toward a clay pit and swamp on the side of the road. The British officers gave chase, but their heavy horses risked getting stuck in the soft earth, forcing them to turn back. Revere's knowledge of the local geography saved him from certain death that night. Returning to the main road, he now sped down the maple-shaded path toward Medford. In American folklore and cartoons, we often see Paul Revere shouting, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" But historical reality was quite different. At that time, most people in Massachusetts still considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Empire. They were British. Shouting, "The British are coming," would have been confusing. Instead, Revere carefully knocked on specific doors where local militia or Minutemen leaders lived. He whispered firmly, "The regulars are coming out." Upon receiving this signal, candles began to flicker in the windows of those houses. Sleeping blacksmith shops, farmhouses, and taverns woke up in an instant.
Fathers took down their old muskets, blowing off the dust, while mothers fought back tears as they handed bags of gunpowder to their sons. Behind Revere, the church bells in the villages began to toll, clang, clang, clang. This was the drumbeat of war. It was nearly midnight. Revere's horse, foaming at the mouth, entered Lexington. His destination was the home of Reverend Jonas Clark, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were sheltering. Sergeant William Monroe was standing guard outside. Seeing Revere dismount, he grumbled, "Don't make so much noise. Everyone is sleeping inside." Exhausted but adrenaline-fueled, Revere shouted his famous reply, "Noise! You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming." The door swung open. Inside, Adams and Hancock could barely believe that General Gage had actually sent an army to capture them. But Revere's dust-covered clothes and the look in his eyes told them the time for politics was over. Now gunpowder would speak. Just then, another rider arrived via a different route. His name was William Dawes. He had brought the same message from Boston by land. The two messengers united, but their work was not done. Concord was still far away, and the rebels' main arsenal was hidden there. They did not know that before the sun rose on Lexington Green, blood would spill, sealing the fate of a nation. Having finished their work in Lexington, Paul Revere and William Dawes set off for Concord around 1 in the morning. On the way, they were coincidentally joined by a young physician, Dr. Samuel Prescott. Prescott was returning from a very personal engagement, visiting his fiancée, Lydia Mulliken. By a cruel twist of fate, he became entangled in a bloody historical war on his way home from his lover's house. As the three riders advanced towards Concord, a British patrol suddenly blocked their path at a desolate spot in Lincoln. It was a trap. Revere and Dawes tried to escape, but Revere was captured by the British. Dawes turned his horse to flee, but fell and got lost in the woods. Only young Prescott, who knew every local alley and shortcut, spurred his horse over a low stone wall and vanished into the forest. Although Paul Revere's name is written in gold in history, in reality it was Dr. Prescott who delivered the final warning to the people of Concord that night. The British officers interrogated Revere, threatened him at gunpoint, and finally confiscated his beloved horse, Brown Beauty. The hero of history had to walk back to Lexington, exhausted and devastated. Meanwhile, dawn was breaking in Lexington. The sky on the morning of April 19th was overcast, the air thick with mist. Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, who was now suffering from tuberculosis, ordered his militia to march out of Buckman Tavern.
Only 77 ordinary villagers, farmers, schoolteachers, blacksmiths lined up on Lexington Green. They held old muskets. Some had only axes or pitchforks. Opposing them was the most disciplined and powerful army in the world. The sound of drums and hundreds of boots thumping against the ground shook the earth. When the massive column of redcoats emerged through the mist, their bayonets glistened in the morning light like a legion of death. Leading the British Marines and Grenadiers was Major John Pitcairn. Sitting atop his horse, sword raised, he shouted, "Disperse, ye rebels! Lay down your arms! Damn you, disperse!" Captain Parker knew winning this unequal battle was mathematically impossible. He ordered his men to remain calm, but his famous command was as solid as steel. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The two sides stood face to face. A strange, suffocating silence gripped the square. The history of the world was seconds away from changing. No one knows who pulled the trigger first. Historians still debate today. Was it a nervous British soldier whose finger slipped, or an excited American hiding behind a stone wall? But suddenly, a gunshot shattered the morning silence. Ralph Waldo Emerson later called it the shot heard round the world. Chaos erupted instantly. The British, waiting for no order, opened fire, and Lexington Green was enveloped in smoke. Within minutes, 8 American patriots lay dead on the grass.
Jonas Parker, the captain's cousin, kept his word. He was shot and fell, yet tried to reload his gun, biting into the ground until his last breath. He did not run. The sun of American independence rose, but it was painted in the fresh blood of its own people. The British won, but they did not know this bloodshed was only the beginning. A greater surprise awaited them in Concord. Leaving 8 lifeless bodies and pools of blood on the green grass of Lexington, the British forces resumed their march toward Concord, believing they had broken the backbone of the rebellion. The sun was now bright, illuminating the redcoats and their polished bayonets with a terrifying brilliance. They did not know that, thanks to Dr. Samuel Prescott's warning, Concord was already prepared. The rebels had hidden their cannon wheels, gunpowder, and muskets in various farmhouses and even under furrows in plowed fields. The British entered Concord and searched thoroughly, but found little. In frustration, they gathered some wooden gun mounts and carriage wheels in the town center and set them on fire. The black smoke rising from this bonfire became the catalyst that turned the tide of the war. Outside the town, on a hill across the North Bridge, about 400 militia from Concord, Acton, Lincoln, and Bedford had gathered. They were led by Colonel James Barrett. Seeing the thick black smoke rising from the town, panic spread among them. Adjutant Joseph Hosmer, shouting in anger, asked the colonel, "Will you let them burn the town down?" This single question forced the hesitant militia to decide. They resolved to march down from the hill to the bridge to protect their town. In the front ranks were a group of brave young men from Acton, led by Captain Isaac Davis. Davis, a gunsmith, had bid farewell to his sick wife and children that morning, saying, "I have a right to go to Concord on the King's Highway, and I intend to go if I have to meet all the British troops in Boston." As the Americans marched toward the bridge in orderly fashion to the tune of the White Cockade, with drums and fifes, the British soldiers were stunned. They thought this was a disorderly mob, but they marched like a professional army. Guarding the other side of the bridge were about 100 British light infantry. As the Americans drew near, the British fired warning shots, then immediately followed with a volley of live fire. Captain Isaac Davis and his fifer, Abner Hosmer, were the first to fall. Seeing his companions drop, Major John Buttrick could remain silent no longer. He leapt up and shouted the historic order, one never before given to British subjects. "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" Hundreds of muskets roared from the American side. For the first time, subjects organized a counterattack against the British Army and were ordered to kill. The British officers were dumbfounded. Their orderly lines broke, and even experienced soldiers began to retreat in panic. They ran back toward Concord, leaving their wounded behind. This was unthinkable. The world's finest army was fleeing from a group of farmers. But the British did not yet realize that their true hell was just beginning. The long 18-mile road back to Boston was about to become Bloody Lane. From every surrounding village and farm, thousands of angry Americans were pouring out like ants, not just with old guns, but with years of pent-up rage. It was now afternoon. After waiting briefly in Concord, the British forces decided to return to Boston. They thought the morning skirmish was over and the rebels had fled in fear. They did not know that their return route had turned into a living hell. News of the battle had spread like wildfire through the Massachusetts villages. Thousands of Minutemen from Chelmsford, Framsing, Reading, and other towns swarmed the road from Concord. The American strategy was completely different, shocking the British. Instead of fighting face-to-face in open fields like traditional European armies, they used the local terrain as a weapon. This was the circle of fire. As the British marched down the main road, invisible enemies fired upon them from behind every New England stone wall, every thick oak tree, and every haystack. At a place called Miriam's Corner, the situation spiraled out of control. Here, the road narrowed over a small bridge, forcing the British column to tighten its ranks. The Americans seized this opportunity. Bullets rained down from all sides. The British soldiers were confused and disoriented. Who were they fighting? The enemy was not standing in front of them. They fired back at puffs of smoke, but the clever militia had already moved to the cover of another tree. The bright red coats of the British made them obvious targets against the green nature, while the Americans, in their drab brown clothes, blended into the earth. The iron discipline of the British began to crack in this unequal fight. Exhausted, hungry, and terrified, the world's best soldiers were now running just to save their lives. Every bend of the road was a death trap. Bloody clashes occurred at places like Brooks Hill and the Bloody Angle. British officers tried desperately to keep their men together with swords drawn, but panic was spreading like a virus. Their ammunition was running low, and they had no wagons to carry the wounded. Many soldiers collapsed by the roadside, never to rise again. A British officer later wrote in his diary, "It seemed as if it rained rebels. Fire was dropping from the hills and woods instead of clouds." The British force was on the verge of annihilation before reaching Lexington. They had no strength left to walk. If they did not receive help at Lexington, General Gage's entire expeditionary force would have been wiped from the pages of history. But as they stepped on Lexington soil, they saw a glimmer of hope. Earl Percy had arrived from Boston.
Boston with about 1,000 troops and 2 powerful cannons to rescue them. This new force temporarily held off the Americans, but the road back to Boston was still long and even more terrifying. Earl Percy's arrival in Lexington was a blessing for the British. He brought fresh troops and, most importantly, 2 6-pound field cannons. The American militia was skilled at musket fighting, but this was their first experience facing the roar of cannon fire. The sound temporarily scattered the militia, allowing Colonel Smith's battered forces to take shelter inside Percy's defensive perimeter. The British soldiers were so exhausted they lay on the ground panting with their tongues out like dogs. Percy allowed them to rest briefly, but he knew stopping for long meant death. From every corner of New England, militia were arriving like locusts. Their numbers now exceeded 4,000. When the British resumed their march toward Boston, the intensity of the battle did not decrease. Instead, it took on a gruesome form. The road from Lexington to Menotomy, present-day Arlington, became the bloodiest battlefield of the day. Over 5,000 shots were fired in Menotomy alone. The fighting here was not limited to long-range fire. It turned into hand-to-hand combat. Americans took positions inside houses along the road. Desperate British soldiers raided these homes. The home of Jason Russell, a 59-year-old lame patriot, became a tragic witness to this struggle. Russell refused to flee, declaring, "An Englishman's home is his castle." He stood at his door to block the British, but was hacked to death by bayonets. Inside his home, the British killed 11 more militia members. The floor of Russell's house was awash in blood, a grim chapter in the history of American independence. The British were now enraged. They attacked anyone they found, looting and setting fire to houses. On the American side, despite the chaos, there was no lack of courage. General William Heath and Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the key leaders of the Boston Rebellion, were present on the battlefield, encouraging the militia. Joseph Warren was so reckless that a British musket ball grazed the hairpin in his head. He survived a near miss, unaware that he would give his life just 2 months later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. As evening approached and the British force reached Charlestown, the heavy guns of the British warships anchored in the river came to their rescue. Fearing the naval bombardment, the militia dared not advance further. The sun set, and the British entered Boston, but they were no longer the arrogant rulers they had been. They were defeated, humiliated, and afraid. That night, the scene in Boston was completely different. The city was effectively under siege. The British were trapped inside, while outside, thousands of campfires lit up the dark hills and villages. The Americans, without a formal army, had stood up to a global superpower and bottled them up. The bloody day of April 19th ended, but it birthed a new reality, the siege of Boston.
And within this siege, America's first official military, the Continental Army, and a new commander-in-chief named George Washington were about to be born. But before Washington arrived, 2 hills north of Boston, Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, were becoming the focal point of the next cataclysmic clash. The British generals were burning with humiliation and desperate for revenge. Boston was now virtually a massive prison. After the humiliating defeat in April, the British forces were trapped on the peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides, while the only land exit, Boston Neck, was heavily guarded by thousands of American rebels. For General Gage and his officers, it was an intolerable situation, the mighty British Army cowering in the city for fear of uneducated farmers. In mid-June, the British decided to break the stalemate. Their plan was to capture the hills of Dorchester Heights and Charlestown outside the city to force the Americans to retreat. But rebel spies were everywhere in Boston, and the news of this secret plan reached the Americans quickly. On the night of June 15th, the rebels made a counter-decision. They would seize the strategic hills of Charlestown before the British could attack. The night of June 16th, 1735. The clock had passed midnight. Led by Colonel William Prescott, about 1,200 American militia marched silently and secretly from Cambridge toward Charlestown. Their destination was Bunker Hill, but due to darkness or a change in strategy, they bypassed Bunker Hill and took position further forward on Breed's Hill, right under the noses of the British cannons. This decision was extremely risky, as it was very close to Boston Harbor and the British ships. Prescott ordered his men to dig a strong earthen fort or redoubt. Hundreds of men began working with picks and shovels, but they were warned, no metal could clang against stone. Below them, on the Charles River, sentries on the anchored British warships regularly shouted, "All is well," completely unaware that a silent death trap was being built right above their heads. Dawn, June 17th. As the first rays of the sun touched the hills of Charlestown, the captain of the British warship HMS Lively was startled. Where yesterday was green grass and empty fields, today stood a massive 6-foot-high earthen fort. Without waiting for orders, the captain opened fire. The city of Boston shook, waking General Gage and General William Howe. Looking through binoculars at the hill, they could not believe their eyes. General Howe remarked, "The rebels have done more in one night than my whole army would have done in 1 month." The British High Command realized that if the Americans held this hill, their cannons could destroy the entire Boston Harbor. They had only one option, a direct attack. Under the harsh noon sun and stifling heat, the British prepared for battle. General William Howe, one of the British Army's best field commanders, decided against using any flanking maneuvers or trickery. He wanted to intimidate the Americans and break their morale, so he decided to attack head-on, in open daylight, in an open field. More than 2,000 redcoats, carrying heavy packs and glistening bayonets, crossed the Charles River by boat and landed on the shores of Charlestown. They believed the sight of the disciplined British lines would send the Americans running, but behind the earthen fort on the hill, Colonel Prescott and his men were planning something else. Their gunpowder supply was critically low, so Prescott issued his famous and historic order, now part of American folklore: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The British began to march slowly up the hill to the beat of drums, unaware they were walking into a certain death trap. As the British soldiers climbed the slope of Breed's Hill in the scorching summer sun, their heavy wool uniforms and massive packs slowed them down. The tall grass hid American pits
and fences that broke their orderly lines. Inside the earthen fort above, there was a terrifying silence. Colonel Prescott walked along the parapet, sword drawn, repeating, "Wait, do not rush." When the sound of British boots was close, just 40 or 50 yards away, Prescott signaled. With the command, "Fire," the entire hill erupted. The American muskets roared in unison like a volcano. The front ranks of British soldiers fell before they knew what hit them.
The soldiers behind them were stunned by this sudden and devastating attack. General Howe watched his proud army collapse like a house of cards. Amidst smoke and blood, the British were forced to retreat for the first time. Thousands of Bostonians watching from rooftops and windows could not believe their eyes. General Howe felt humiliated. He reorganized his soldiers and ordered a second attack. This time, they stepped over the bodies of their fallen comrades to climb the hill again. But the result was just as horrific. The Americans made every grain of their limited gunpowder count. Again, the British line broke. Again, the green grass of Breed's Hill turned red with blood. British officers were in disarray. All of Howe's aides de camp were killed or wounded. Howe stood alone in the middle of the battlefield, his white stockings soaked red with blood. But the tide turned on the third attack. Unfortunately for the Americans, their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Colonel Prescott realized they could no longer hold them off with bullets. The British, shedding their heavy packs and fixing shiny bayonets to their muskets, charged for the third time. The Americans fired their last few rounds, but it wasn't enough. The British vaulted the dirt walls and poured into the fort. A brutal hand-to-hand fight ensued. The Americans had no bayonets, so they fought the world's best infantry with empty musket butts, stones, and even their bare fists. Amidst this chaos, Dr. Joseph Warren was martyred. He had recently been appointed a major general, but chose to fight as a volunteer with a gun on his shoulder. The British recognized him and shot him in the head at point-blank range. Warren's death was an irreparable loss for America, as he was a key theorist and leader of the revolution. Through dust, smoke, and blood, the Americans finally retreated to Bunker Hill and then to the mainland. The British captured Breed's Hill, but they had no strength left to celebrate. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, including 92 officers. General Howe was mentally broken. British General Henry Clinton described this victory. A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. While a military victory for the British, psychologically, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a massive win for the Americans. They proved that with the right leadership and courage, they could stand toe-to-toe with the British Empire. When news of this battle reached Philadelphia, the Continental Congress realized they no longer needed just a militia, they needed a real national army. And to take charge of that army, a tall, quiet gentleman from Mount Vernon, Virginia, was stepping slowly and calmly onto the stage of history. General George Washington. In the stifling heat of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, while members of the Continental Congress argued, John Adams made a crucial move. He knew that to transform this isolated New England rebellion into a war for American independence, a commander from outside Massachusetts had to be appointed. All eyes turned to a tall, quiet, and grave gentleman from Virginia who attended Congress every day in full military uniform. He was George Washington. He never asked for the position, but his presence said he was ready. When Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief, Washington stood and humbly said, "I accept this honor, but I warn you beforehand, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." He refused a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. This selfless patriotism instantly made Washington an undisputed leader. July 3, 1775. Under a massive elm tree on Cambridge Common, George Washington officially took command of the newly formed Continental Army. History depicts this moment as majestic, but the reality was a nightmare for Washington. He thought he was coming to lead an army, but he found an armed and chaotic mob. About 16,000 men gathered, but they had no uniforms and no orderly tents. Soldiers lived in shacks made of wood, stone, canvas, and even grass. An unbearable stench arose from the camp due to lack of sanitation. But the bigger problem was discipline. Officers gambled and drank with common soldiers, and no one saluted anyone. These independent-minded New Englanders did not believe in following orders or hierarchy. Washington wrote in frustration in his diary, "They are an exceedingly dirty and nasty people. It is impossible to fight with them." Washington began to restore discipline with an iron hand. Using the threat of the lash and severe punishment, he tried to transform this mob into a force. But a danger greater than discipline awaited him. A few days after taking charge, he checked his supplies and was horrified. He knew gunpowder was low, but the report showed only 36 barrels remained for the entire army. That meant not even 9 rounds per man. If the British knew Washington had no bullets, they could have laughed, attacked the camp, and ended the rebellion. Washington was so shaken that it is said he could not speak for half an hour. He kept this information strictly secret and ordered soldiers to fill barrels with sand to make British spies think they had plenty of powder. To retake Boston, Washington needed heavy cannons to threaten the British ships, but the Americans had none. In this moment of despair, a large 25-year-old young man named Henry Knox stood before Washington. Knox was a Boston bookseller with no formal military education. He had learned artillery solely by reading books in his shop. Knox made an impossible and crazy proposal. He said 300 miles away at Fort Ticonderoga in New York, recently captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, dozens of British heavy cannons were sitting idle. Knox proposed to drag them back, but in between lay ice-cold rivers, rugged mountains, and dense forests. Hauling 59 cannons weighing 60 tons on sleds over 300 miles in winter was beyond imagination. But Washington had no choice. He bet on this young bookseller. Thus began one of the most difficult logistical operations in history, the Noble Train of Artillery. The winter of 1775 was one of the harshest in New England's history. Freezing winds cut to the bone, and Henry Knox was engaged in an impossible battle against nature. Dragging 59 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston was a mad expedition. Knox procured 80 pairs of oxen and massive sleds from local farmers. The ice on Lake George and the Hudson River was treacherous. At any moment it could break, swallowing the sleds and cannons. And it happened. While crossing the Hudson, an 18-pounder cannon broke through the ice and sank. Knox's men gave up, but the bookseller-turned-artilleryman refused to quit. He sent men into the
freezing water to tie ropes and hauled the sunken cannon back up. Then came the steep slopes of the Berkshire Mountains. The snow was so deep the oxen couldn't move. Knox, with his booming voice and relentless enthusiasm, drove the exhausted and frightened men to do the impossible. After an epic 40-day journey, when Knox arrived at Washington's camp outside Boston in January 1776, he looked like a snowman. But behind him, arranged on sleds, was the key to independence: big guns. With the cannons in hand, George Washington wasted no time. He knew the key to retaking Boston was Dorchester Heights, south of the city. The hill overlooked the city and harbor, making it easy to bombard British ships. The problem was that the hill was in plain view of the British, and the ground was frozen so hard that digging trenches was impossible. Washington used a brilliant engineering trick. He had prepared wooden frames called chandeliers and thousands of bundles of hay. On the night of March 4, 1776, he ordered a cannon bombardment at the other end of the city to divert British attention. Under that cover, about 3,000 American soldiers and hundreds of ox carts moved silently up Dorchester Heights. Wheels were wrapped in cloth to dampen the sound. All night, soldiers built an impregnable fortress using the wooden frames and hay on the frozen ground. The next morning, March 5th, the 6th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, British General William Howe woke up, looked out his window, and couldn't believe his eyes. Where yesterday there was an empty hill, today stood a massive fortress with Henry Knox's terrifying cannons peeking through the walls. Howe shouted in panic, "The rebels have done more in one night than my whole army would have done in 6 months." The British admiral informed him that if the Americans held the hill, no ship was safe in the harbor. Howe initially planned a counterattack, but God seemed to side with the Americans. A fierce storm blew in that afternoon, preventing British boats from landing. Howe realized the game was up. Boston could not be saved. He reached a tacit agreement with Washington. If the British were allowed to leave safely, they would not burn the city.
March 17, 1776. This day is known in Boston history as Evacuation Day. About 11,000 British soldiers and 1,000 Loyalists boarded ships and left Boston. When the Americans entered the city, their joy knew no bounds. The 11-month siege was over. Through this bloodless victory, Washington proved he was not just a general, but a brilliant strategist. But amidst the celebration, Washington knew the war was not over. It had just begun. The British had left Boston, but they would return with greater force, and their next target would be the economic heart of America, New York City. Washington hurried his army toward New York, where a catastrophe awaited him. New York City, summer of 1776. The joy of the Boston victory was fading as George Washington realized he had stepped into a terrible strategic trap. Boston was landlocked, but New York City was a city of islands, Manhattan, Long Island, Staten Island, all surrounded by water. Fighting in such a place against the world's most powerful navy was embracing suicide. Washington's Continental Army numbered about 19,000, mostly inexperienced teenagers or farmers, many without shoes. Washington split this small force between Manhattan and Brooklyn Heights on Long Island. He knew the British would return with their massive fleet and trap them like rats on these isolated islands. His fears came true all too soon. In late June, what appeared on the horizon of New York Harbor chilled the blood of American sentries. Not one or two ships, but a massive forest seemed to be floating across the Atlantic. British General William Howe had returned, with his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, and they were not alone. They brought over 400 warships and transport ships. New York Harbor became so crowded with masts, it looked like a floating pine forest. It was the largest invasion force ever to set foot on American soil up to that time. 32,000 well-trained soldiers, including thousands of German mercenaries or Hessians. These Hessians were terrifying warriors, their reputation for cruelty legendary. Seeing this massive British display, New York's Loyalists erupted in joy, while despair gripped the Patriots. Washington watched through his binoculars, wondering how his amateur force could stop this tidal wave of military power. Yet amidst this extreme uncertainty, a bolt of lightning came from Philadelphia. The Continental Congress had finally decided no more compromise, full independence. On July 4th, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was adopted. On July 9th, Washington ordered his troops to gather at the Commons, now City Hall Park, in New York. There, an officer shouted out the historic document, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Hearing these words of freedom, a strange frenzy spread among the soldiers and civilians. Forgetting the fear of war, they ran to Bowling Green Park in Manhattan. There stood a massive lead statue of King George III on horseback. The excited crowd pulled the statue down with ropes. The king's head was cut off and paraded on a pike, while the remaining 4,000 pounds of lead were sent to be melted into 42,000 musket balls. The Americans chanted, "We will welcome the royal troops with the king's own lead." But the celebration was short-lived. In late August, the British made their move. On August 22nd, General Howe began landing his massive force from Staten Island to Gravesend Bay on Long Island. 15,000 British and 5,000 Hessian soldiers landed unopposed. Washington was unsure where the British would strike, Manhattan or Long Island. Acting on bad intelligence, he kept his forces divided. On Long Island, the Americans were led by General Israel Putnam, who knew little of the local geography. In the early morning of August 27th, the British, guided by a local loyalist, planned to flank the Americans through the unguarded Jamaica Pass. As the Americans prepared to face the British from the front, they had no idea that thousands of redcoats were silently approaching from behind, carrying their death warrants. The first and biggest disaster of the war was about to begin, the Battle of Long Island. Morning, August 27th. As sunlight pierced the mist, the American defenders on Long Island faced a horrifying truth. They were ready to hold off the Hessians and British from the front, but suddenly the sound of drums and thousands of boots came from the woods behind them. General Howe's flanking trap had worked perfectly. The Americans found themselves caught between two fires, Hessian bayonets in front and British heavy cavalry in the rear. Instantly, the orderly battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse. There was no escape, only swamps and death. Inexperienced American teenagers ran for their lives, but the Hessians were merciless. They bayoneted many who tried to surrender.
Amidst this catastrophe, an unforgettable saga of heroism was written, known today in American history as the Maryland 400. Near the old stone house, about 400 brave young men from Maryland, led by General Lord Sterling, stood against the massive British force in a suicide mission. Their goal was not to win, but to buy time for the rest of the army to escape with their lives. They charged the British line not once, but 6 times. George Washington watched this from Brooklyn Heights. Seeing these young men leap into certain death, he cried out in anguish, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose!" The blood of the Marylanders turned Gowanus Creek red, but their sacrifice allowed the rest of the American army to retreat to the fort at Brooklyn Heights. By afternoon, Washington's entire army was cornered at Brooklyn Heights. The situation was dire. The turbulent East River was behind them, and 20,000 victorious British soldiers were digging trenches in front of them. General Howe could have launched a final attack that day to destroy the Continental Army and end the dream of independence, but the memory of the heavy losses at Bunker Hill haunted him. He thought, "The prey is in the trap. Why rush? I'll catch them slowly tomorrow morning." Howe's caution was a historic mistake. Nature, too, seemed to side with America. A storm with heavy rain began, followed by a fierce northeasterly wind that prevented British warships from entering the river to cut off the escape route. Night, August 29th. Washington realized that digging in meant death or capture. He made an impossible decision. He would evacuate his entire force of 9,000 men, horses, cannons, and supplies across the river to Manhattan in the dark. Moving such a large force right under the British noses was madness. Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment were called upon. Glover's men were experienced fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts. They began ferrying soldiers in small boats through the storm and darkness. The breathless operation lasted all night. But dawn was approaching, and many soldiers were still on the Brooklyn side. If the sun rose, the British would see them and destroy everything with cannon fire. Just then, a miracle happened. A dense white fog blanketed the river and Brooklyn Heights. The fog was so thick one couldn't see 6 feet away. Under this natural curtain, when Washington and the last soldier stepped safely onto Manhattan, the fog lifted. The British woke to find the nest empty, the prey gone. Washington had vanished with his army like a magician. Even after escaping to Manhattan, Washington found no relief. On the morning of September 15th, British warships opened fire on the Kips Bay area of the East River. The ground shook with the roar of bombardment as British and Hessian troops began landing. Seeing this, the nerves of the American militia shattered. Without offering any resistance, without firing a shot, they fled their trenches like wild rabbits. Washington galloped to the scene to find a shameful sight, his soldiers throwing away guns and bags, running in panic. In rage, humiliation, and despair, he threw his hat on the ground and shouted, "Good God, are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" He was so stunned that he sat motionless on his horse with the British only 80 yards away. His aides finally grabbed his reins and forced him away, or the commander-in-chief might have been captured that day, ending the revolution. The British captured New York City.
They thought they had secured a comfortable winter quarter and crushed the rebels. But at midnight on September 21st, the sky turned red. A mysterious and terrible fire engulfed New York. Known as the Great Fire of New York, it burned wooden houses like matchsticks. The wind carried the flames up Broadway. The spire of the historic Trinity Church collapsed into the fire, a catastrophic sight. The British accused Washington of setting the fire under a scorched earth policy, though Congress had rejected his proposal to burn the city. To this day, it is unknown who started the fire, rebels or an accident. But 1/3 of the city burned to ash, and the British won a ruin. Amidst the smoke and chaos, Washington knew he couldn't fight blindly. He needed to know the British next move. He asked for a volunteer to go behind enemy lines as a spy. A 22-year-old Yale graduate and schoolteacher from Connecticut named Nathan Hale stepped forward. Hale had no spying experience, only a heart full of patriotism. Disguised as a Dutch schoolmaster, he entered Long Island and drew maps of British positions. But on his way back, he fell into a trap set by the notorious British Ranger Robert Rogers. Papers hidden in his shoe sole gave him away. General Howe ordered him hanged without trial. On the morning of September 22nd, standing on the gallows, when the executioner asked for his last words, this young teacher did not tremble. Instead, in a steady, steel-like voice, he uttered one of the greatest patriotic quotes in history. "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Nathan Hale's body was left hanging for days to terrify the rebels. But instead of fear, Hale's sacrifice ignited a fire of revenge in American hearts stronger than cannonballs. Meanwhile, Washington retreated with his broken army from Manhattan to White Plains, facing a long, dark winter. After losing New York, Washington's army turned into a ragged band of nomads. In the Battle of White Plains, the Americans could not stand against the combined British and Hessian forces. After the fall of Chatterton Hill, Washington realized that a head-on battle with the British was suicide. He planned to retreat to New Jersey, but a greater disaster awaited him. Fort Washington, on the north tip of Manhattan, was the last American stronghold. General Nathanael Greene had assured Washington the fort was impregnable. Washington made the mistake of trusting Greene over his own judgment. On November 16th, the British attacked Fort Washington from 3 sides. The fort's fall was hastened by a traitor named William de Monte, who handed the blueprints to the British. From the cliffs of Fort Lee across the river, Washington watched helplessly through binoculars as his best 3,000 soldiers surrendered. He saw Hessians bayoneting his unarmed men. History records that Washington, known as the Iron Man of America, wept like a child at the sight. The loss of these 3,000 men and vast stores of weapons broke the Continental Army's back. Then began the infamous retreat across the Jerseys. British General Cornwallis chased Washington like a hunting dog. Washington's force was no longer an army. They were a group of starving, exhausted skeletons in rags. The winter cold caused the soles of their shoes to fall off. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, leaving trails of fresh blood on the snow. The British followed those bloodstains. By December, Washington's troop strength dropped from 20,000 to just 3,000. Most enlistments would expire on December 31st. This meant that before the New Year's sun rose, Washington would go from general to common citizen, and America would return to being a British colony. Congress fled Philadelphia to Baltimore. Ordinary people began making white flags to welcome
The British. The revolution was practically dead. But in this deep darkness, a man sat by a campfire and picked up a pen. His name was Thomas Paine. He began writing a pamphlet to boost morale, the first line of which was as powerful as gunpowder. These are the times that try men's souls. Washington ordered Paine's The American Crisis read to his dispirited soldiers. The words worked like magic. Washington realized only a miracle could save the revolution now. He retreated across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania with his remaining broken force and seized all boats on the river so the British couldn't follow. The British camped in Trenton, New Jersey, across the river, suspending the war for winter. They thought, what can these bigger Americans do in this blizzard? But Washington knew when your back is against the wall, the only way is to attack. He called a secret meeting of his officers and spread a map on the table. His finger pointed to Trenton. He said, Christmas night, when the Hessians are drunk and asleep, we will cross the river and attack. The plan was madness. Crossing an ice-choked river in a blizzard to attack? No one believed it. But Washington looked at his pocket watch and said, victory or death. That would be tonight's password. Christmas night, 1776. Nature seemed to declare war on Washington. A ferocious nor'easter storm began, raining snow and hail like thousands of needles. The Delaware River was a death trap filled with floating ice. John Glover's Marblehead sailors fought the storm, rowing the flat-bottomed Durham boats. In the darkness, Washington stood at the front of a boat, holding his cape with one hand, staring at the horizon. Beside him stood the massive Henry Knox, his booming voice shouting orders over the storm to position the cannons. The crossing was supposed to finish by midnight, but due to ice and storm, it took until 4 a.m. Washington knew he lost the element of darkness, but there was no turning back. He whispered, "Move on. Delay is death." After crossing, the 9-mile march to Trenton began. The blizzard intensified. Many soldiers had no shoes. They walked with rags on their feet. Their footprints on the white snow were bright red, blood. 2 soldiers froze to death on the way, but the rest did not stop. News reached Washington that the storm had soaked the muskets' gunpowder. They couldn't fire. Any other general might have canceled the attack, but Washington calmly replied, "Tell them to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton." This indomitable will made the impossible possible. When the Americans reached the outskirts of Trenton at 8 a.m., the Hessians were still in their barracks. Hessian commander Colonel Johann Rall had been alert the night before, but seeing the storm's severity, he thought no madman would attack in this weather, and canceled the dawn patrol. Suddenly, Hessian sentries heard a strange sound. Out of the mist and snow burst a group of ghosts. No, American soldiers. The sentry screamed, "Der Feind! Der Feind!" The enemy. But it was too late. Americans poured into the town from 3 sides. Since the gunpowder was wet, Henry Knox's cannons became the primary weapon. A young captain named Alexander Hamilton positioned his cannons at the head of the street and fired grape shot as Hessians rushed out. The world's best Hessian troops scattered in the face of cannon fire in narrow streets. As they tried to form lines, Americans charged with bayonets. Colonel Rall was shot off his horse while trying to rally his men. In his pocket was a warning note received the previous night, unread. If he had read it, history might have been different. The battle lasted only 45 minutes. The result was incredible. 22 Hessians killed, 92 wounded, and about 1,000 captured. On the American side, no one died in battle. Only the 2 who froze and a few were wounded, including James Monroe, future president. When Washington visited the dying Colonel Rall, it was a strange scene. The American force, considered beggars days ago, were now proud victors. This victory was not just military, it was psychological. Within a week, Washington launched another surprise attack at Princeton, defeating the British. In just 10 days, the despair of the American crisis vanished, replaced with new hope. New Jersey was reclaimed, and European monarchs like Frederick the Great were forced to praise Washington's winter campaign. The revolution survived, but now Washington faced a different enemy, more terrible than the British: hunger and disease in the cursed winter of Valley Forge. The spring and summer of 1777 brought a new nightmare for Washington. The excitement of Trenton had faded, and British General William Howe now set his sights on the heart of the American Revolution, Philadelphia. Capturing the city where the Continental Congress made laws meant driving the final nail into the revolution's coffin.
On September 11th, the two armies clashed at Brandywine Creek. On that foggy morning, General Howe again used his old tactic, the flanking movement. Washington was confused again. Due to faulty intelligence, he failed to realize the British had exposed his right flank by crossing at an unguarded ford upstream. By the time he realized, it was too late. The Battle of Brandywine turned into a bloody defeat. Yet in this darkness, a bright star emerged, a 19-year-old Frenchman named Marquis de Lafayette. This aristocrat had come to America voluntarily to fight for liberty. Even after being shot in the leg at Brandywine, he did not leave the field, but tried desperately to rally the chaotic American soldiers. Washington was impressed by this brave young man and told the doctors, "Treat him as if he were my son." That day, one of history's most famous father-son relationships was born. After the defeat at Brandywine, saving Philadelphia was impossible. On September 26th, the British Army marched triumphantly into the American capital. Congress fled to York to save their lives. The Liberty Bell, symbol of freedom, was hidden in a hay wagon and smuggled out so the British couldn't melt it for cannonballs. British officers settled in comfortable Philadelphia homes. For them, a festive winter began. Ballroom dancing, gambling, and drinking every night. Meanwhile, Washington took his defeated, tired, and battered army to a desolate plateau just 18 miles away called Valley Forge. Though named a valley, it was a high defensive ground, suitable for defense, but hell for living. December 19, 1777. The march into Valley Forge was a pathetic sight. Looking at the line of 12,000 soldiers would make anyone shudder. Most had no coats, many had torn pants, and thousands were barefoot. Their footprints on the white snow were bright red, blood. 2 soldiers froze to death on the way, but the rest did not stop. News reached Washington that the storm had soaked the muskets' gunpowder. They couldn't fire. Any other general might have canceled the attack, but Washington calmly replied, "Tell them to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton." This indomitable will made the impossible possible. When the Americans reached the outskirts of Trenton at 8 a.m., the Hessians were still in their barracks. Hessian commander Colonel Johann Rall had been alert the night before, but seeing the storm's severity, he thought no madman would attack in this weather, and canceled the dawn patrol.
As winter deepened, the situation at Valley Forge turned horrific. The supply system completely collapsed. Soldiers went days without food. Their main diet was fire cake, a tasteless mixture of flour and water baked on a hot stone. Meat was a dream. Soldiers boiled their shoe leather to eat out of hunger. Then came the epidemics, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia. On average, 10 to 12 soldiers died daily. No meat, no soldier, this chant floated through the camp air. Sitting in his tent by candlelight, Washington wrote letter after letter to Congress, pleading for help. But Congress was broke. They had nothing to give. Washington's own political enemies were plotting to remove him. It seemed the British didn't need bullets. The winter of Valley Forge would bury the dream of American independence under the snow. But Washington did not know that a strange-looking Prussian officer was coming from across the ocean to transform this mess into a professional army. Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived as a beacon of hope in the snow-covered hell of Valley Forge. He was a Prussian officer who spoke almost no English, but he knew the language of war perfectly. He saw the American soldiers were brave but lacked discipline. Steuben stood in the mud and began working as a drill master himself. He taught soldiers how to march in lines, how to reload muskets quickly, and most importantly, how to use the bayonet. Americans previously used bayonets to roast meat. Steuben taught them it was a terrifying weapon of war. Under his strict training, the beggar army of Valley Forge transformed over the winter into a steely professional force. Meanwhile, good news arrived. France recognized American independence and was sending a navy and money as allies. This news sent morale skyrocketing. Washington realized it was no longer time for defense, it was time to attack.
The final chapter of the war was written in October 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Lord Cornwallis was stationed on the Yorktown Peninsula. He was certain the Royal Navy would protect him or supply him by sea. But he did not know that a massive French fleet led by Admiral de Grasse had blocked the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. British ships were forced to flee. Cornwallis was trapped. Meanwhile, Washington and French General Rochambeau executed a rapid march to surround Yorktown by land. A terrible siege began. Cannon fire continued day and night. The Americans, who once starved at Valley Forge, now had the British surrounded. On the night of October 14, led by Alexander Hamilton and French officers, a bayonet charge captured the last two key British redoubts, Redoubts 9 and 10. Cornwallis realized all escape routes were closed. October 19, 1781. The morning sky was clear. A historic scene unfolded on the fields of Yorktown. British drummers beat a melancholic rhythm, and their band played an old British song, "The World Turned Upside Down." The proud army of the world's most powerful empire, which once arrogantly claimed it would crush America, walked with heads bowed between two lines of French and American soldiers to lay down their arms. General Cornwallis was so humiliated he did not attend the surrender ceremony, claiming illness, and sent his deputy, General Charles O'Hara. O'Hara first tried to offer his sword to the French general, who refused and pointed to Washington. Washington also refused to take the sword from a defeated deputy and directed his own deputy, Benjamin Lincoln, to accept it. The sound of thousands of muskets hitting the ground declared America is free. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the war, though it formally concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But the most surprising and magnificent moment of this story happened not on the battlefield, but in Annapolis, Maryland. History shows that victorious generals often seize power to become dictators or kings. Everyone thought George Washington would become the King of America. But on December 23, 1783, Washington stood before Congress and submitted his resignation. He said, "I take my leave of all the employments of public life." Hearing this, King George III remarked in amazement, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington kept his word. He returned to his farm at Mount Vernon as a simple citizen. And thus, in exchange for blood, sweat, tears, and indomitable courage, a new nation was born, one with no king, only we the people. From Paul Revere's midnight ride to the victory at Yorktown, this was the epic journey of history through American eyes.